So, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the research that we've started with the Origins of Doha project. We're a little bit over halfway through. We've done a lot. We're still gathering data. These are some of the first glimpses that we shall see. So I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail. As I said earlier, later on we'll get some more detail from the specialist studies and the GIS and things like that. I'll start by really outlining the nature of the project which we've been running. The main aim is to look at Doha and its people. So to trace its development and the experiences of its people from the foundation of the town up until the transition to the oil economy and the beginnings of the impact of the oil revenues. And to this end, I have been trying to find good places to excavate in Doha for a couple of years, because my studies of the maps indicated that the central core of Doha and the twin town of Bidda, which was originally a separate settlement, should survive archaeologically. And I was very lucky that Qatar Museums was able to facilitate an excavation in the centre of town, which we shall come to in more detail, in quite a lot of detail later on. Here is a picture of one of the excavation trenches, and you will all recognise the Fanar building behind it. I'll show you where that is on a map in just a minute. Now, archaeology is my thing, and it's what I'm interested in, and I hope that I'm good at it, and I'm interested in the Gulf towns as well, and the archaeology of the Gulf towns. But this is an interdisciplinary study. So we have other streams, other strands of research which are equally important. Most importantly, we have ethnographic research, historical research, which some of it we can do ourselves as archaeologists, GIS work, and a very important element of trying to get this information out there to the public, the people of Doha, not just the nationals, but anybody who's interested in the heritage of Doha. This is very much a work in progress. If we get continuation of our grant, one of our focuses will be to try and bring our research to the people in every way that we can. By way of historical background, I should explain that map really. This is the first useful map of Doha. It shows Doha and it shows Bidda in 1823 or 1822. It was mapped by British naval surveyors from the East India Company because the British were very active in the Gulf at that time, basically taking control of it. And in order to do so, they needed to know where they could take their boats. Because the locals, of course, whom they were not always allied with, sometimes warring against, knew this area very well. And the British needed to be able to match that knowledge. So they produced some really excellent maps for the time. Now, my interest in Doha is partly stimulated by an interest in pearl fishing and the formative impact that pearl fishing had on the Gulf. Most of the Gulf towns we have today were founded in the 18th and 19th century as pearling towns, and Doha is one of them. Here's just a map to show that. All these red dots are new foundations in the 18th and 19th century. The older settlements are marked in black. This ties Doha and the Gulf towns into the global economy. The reason the pearl fishery was so powerful and so important in this time is because this part of the world was linking up very closely to Western markets, and there was a huge demand for pearls in the West. So prices were doubling every couple of years at the end of the 19th century, and there was a huge spike in revenues. But this process had begun earlier in the 18th century, when people went to the coast and founded towns. So one of the things we're interested in seeing is how were these towns founded, what did they look like, how did they develop as the pearl revenues increased, especially during that spike in the late 19th and early 20th century. Okay. The second very useful map we have actually shows the outline of Doha and the outline of Bidda with walls and the beginnings of a new settlement known as Little Doha, Doehat or Dohat al-Sagir, stretching in between them. Now we understand this as the central area next to Souq Waqif. This is effectively what became Jasra and Souq Waqif itself, just where my dot is. And this is Bidda, which is now parkland. A closer look. You can see the walled cities. We haven't found the city walls in our excavations, but I believe that Muhammad Ali Abdullah has. There's a picture of, he's here in the front row. There's a picture of him above a part of the city wall which is exposed during development work around the souk. We were excavating, aiming to excavate inside this footprint of 1860 Doha, where we expected it to go back to the foundation of the town. Today, this would be the footprint of 1860 Doha, and this would be 1860 Bidda. The Amiri Diwan is in between, and the land has been reclaimed for several hundred meters in that direction. In the 50s, you still have the old town, the skeleton of the old town showing through. This is before major development in the early 50s. And this road system we consider to mark pretty much exactly the original extent of the town in the mid-19th century, because roads tend to develop along the walls, especially when the walls collapsed. So if we dug in here, we considered that we would get really through to early Doha. And this is what it looks like today. It was cleared in, I think, around about 2006 because the buildings were very, very dilapidated. And we had an idea that underneath this area, archaeology would survive. And actually, fortunately, it did. Here are a couple of the trenches. This is the UCL-Qatar Origins of Doha excavation trench. This is one of the Qatar Museum's ones, because we had a joint excavation. This area is now slated for development, a point we shall come to shortly. I think you know where I'm talking about, yeah? Everyone must recognize that patch. That is about 2/3 of the footprint of Old Doha. And we were able to have 3 large excavation trenches, which still only covers a small percentage of the entire site. That's quite important. And in each one of these, we were able to get a sequence, in at least 3 of them, that probably went back to the foundation of the town. And that tells us a lot about how people were living. And eventually, once we finished our specialist studies, it'll tell us how that living, that way of life changed and responded to changes in wealth and global trends, economic trends. This is actually very important. I don't know of a single other Gulf town that has a big patch of archaeology going back to the foundation in the middle of it, like possibly Ras Al Khaimah in the UAE. Most of the other towns, they've already built up the centres with deep foundation buildings which completely remove the archaeology. There may be patches surviving here and there in Dubai, for example, but I don't think there's anything like that. At the moment, this area is going to be converted to a metro, and the fate of the rest of this area remains undecided. We hope that development can be sympathetic to the archaeology that still survives there, i.e. not destroy it. Now I'll tell you a tiny bit about the dig. This is, I'll only talk about the UCL trenches. We have Dr. Ferhan Sakal here who will tell us about the Qatar Museum's trenches, and my field director Dan Edisford will give you more detail about the UCL trenches later. So I'm not going to show you much, but this is where our trench was located on a 1950s map. So we expected to hit, hopefully, at the top of the sequence, these buildings, and then find out what was underneath them. And sure enough, we did. Always satisfying when a plan comes together. We had about 2 meters of stratigraphy. Now, that means 2 meters of superimposed buildings, buildings which had been built and then collapsed or been pulled down. Other buildings had been built on top, and the foundations of the old ones remain buried in the ground, together with evidence of what was happening around them. The rubbish that people lose and throw away or bury, so bones, pottery, that kind of thing. At the bottom, the buildings were not very well preserved. And in fact, we do know that earlier in the 19th century, all the way up to 1867, Doha was regularly attacked and even flattened. So So most of our well-built sequence from around about here upwards is from the 1870s onwards, which coincides with the start of the massive spike in pearling revenues and also the collapse of the pearl industry. And our sequence went all the way up to the 60s or 70s when we see the big changes happening with the coming of oil. It becomes very clear. These changes start happening very dramatically in the 1950s, in fact. So to give you an idea, again, I'm just giving you an example here. One of our levels showed two house compounds, an alleyway, two back-to-back kitchens, we think, belonging to different house compounds. Here's one of our excavators standing in one of these kitchens. And this gives us a very good idea of the kind of houses that people lived in prior to the modern era, how the ordinary people lived. And these are the ovens that went with these kitchens. We dug through the alleyways. This showed, the alleyway sequence showed that the site, the plan of the settlement, the location of the alleyways and the houses and the compounds more or less stayed stable from the 1860s or so onwards. But the ground was rising around as each building was built and as sand came in. So the alleyway walls were raised as time went on. And it led down to the sea. I mentioned that we're interested in the debris of everyday life because they tell us a lot about how people were living and how they fed themselves and what they were doing for a livelihood and what they were buying and using on a daily basis. I'll mention this. I have a presentation later about daily life in Doha when I'll come back to this. Bone remains are very important. We have another presentation on diet in Doha. This work is only just starting, but we hope to see exactly what people were eating and how the food was being prepared. Imported materials are quite common. Humble things like glass bottles and pottery. And some evidence of life at sea. This is just one example of several examples that we have. This is an anchor, which would have been used for a fishing boat or a pearling boat. We have literally crates and crates of finds from this excavation from the QM trenches and the UCL Qatar trenches, which need study, and we have begun those studies. You see a lot of pottery in museums. Now we have the archaeological examples to go with the complete examples which were gathered in the 1970s as part of the ethnographic collections. Now, the one thing I would say before we go any further is that these little bits of broken stuff, which might be regarded just as rubbish by the people who threw it away, will remain no more than broken objects unless we can actually hook it onto lived experience, unless we can relate it to the experience of the people who lived in the town, because this is very, very much still a living memory. There are people alive today who still remember what life was like in the traditional town. And we're gathering those testimonies as much as we can with our oral history team to attach life, to bring these objects to life, which is very important, especially when you think about the future for museums and future interpretation of these finds. We have some coins from the excavation, and one of the things that we hope to learn is how integrated Doha was in the global economy prior to the coming of oil revenues and as oil revenues came in. It's often assumed to be quite a quiet town that was really quite closed off and private, if you like, but in fact it was very tightly involved in global networks. This is not often realized. And the variety of foreign coinage that we are finding, which is being conserved and cleaned up at the moment, and we have Indian coins, Omani coins, British coins, Persian coins, is showing that we have quite a complex monetary economy. We're also recording patches of the surviving traditional architecture in Doha. My team have been around many of the areas where traditional housing still remains. Here's an example of a traditional house built in the 1950s, which is still standing. We recorded it because this is not often done. Mostly people record the elite houses, the big ones. And simple architecture like this is ignored, and then it collapses. This is still important, and it also helps us understand the architecture that we're excavating in the old town in the centre. Another thing we're doing, which will be discussed in more detail later in the workshop, is we are conducting a lot of GIS analyses, and one of the things we're interested in is how Doha grew through time. We've actually digitized the whole of the traditional town from aerial imagery and maps as it survived up to the 1950s. But you can see the way the districts grew, that initially this is the earliest kind of a map we can recreate. Initially they were along the sea, and as late as 1908 it had grown considerably around the sea as new groups came and settled in Doha to make money from the pearling industry. And it's not until the 1950s that you see large inland districts emerging, by which time the pearl fishery was dead. This is the important thing. People liked to live by the sea because they went fishing and they went pearl fishing. Their life was based around the sea within Doha. This changed, of course, and especially as many other groups came to live in the town who were not so tightly integrated with the maritime life. I mentioned the importance of the ethnographic studies. We have a section on this later on this afternoon. And here we will find out how we can relate our discoveries to the memories of the people of Doha and Qatar, as I said before. We intend to continue this work. We also hope to look into the archives of the Ministry of Culture, to look at previous oral histories. Fahad Al-Abaidli is here who's doing that for us, and we will tie these memories to what we are excavating. And in fact, the other ethnographic element that's extremely important to our study is the question of Qatari identity. Qatari society is very complex, especially to outsiders. We don't pretend to understand it very well, but we're trying to learn about it and find out how Qatari identity has been forged from these diverse identities that also make up Qatari society. And this is another important element of the study. By showing people how people lived together in the past, we can in fact shed light on how they're living together in the present. And it's this understanding and interpretation of the past which is one of the reasons that we do things like archaeology, anthropology, and historical studies. We're trying to find its relevance. There are some people here in the audience who do a great deal of work on reinterpreting the heritage of Doha, for example, to see how it can be made relevant today. Souk Waqif is an example. It's a recreation of an old souk for modern people, and it works very well. We have the architect of it here, in fact, I'm very pleased to say, one of our speakers, Muhammad Ali Abdullah. Would it be possible to do that kind of thing with the site in central Doha? I don't know. It's a very different kind of site. It's flat. It's already gone from the surface. What we have is below ground. If it is to be interpreted in a visual way on site, then there would have to be further excavation. I will just finish this introduction by saying that we should regard these kind of archaeological sites as an extremely positive asset. They're often regarded as something of a problem because you can't do anything with it, you can't touch it, it's going to be a barrier to development or whatever. But in fact, in my view, it enhances development because it gives you opportunities to investigate things like heritage and identity, which simply would not be there if the site did not survive. And then, I don't really want to speak too much on behalf of Qatari nationals, but I would say that knowing how the town developed and knowing how people's ancestors were living and how people's more immediate parents and grandparents adapted and moved into modern life can only strengthen self-knowledge and identity and help develop this sense of pride in the past, which is extremely important when you have a rapidly developing nation. For visitors and expatriates, the information, the objects, the buildings and the site itself can enhance the visitor experience. This can be part of a tourism facet of archaeology and cultural heritage studies on Doha. And it will help visitors understand the Qatari experience as well. So I'm going to finish with a question, which is it possible to maximize the potential from a site like this and preserve it and excavate it rather than destroy it? And I ask that as a question because I have no answer. I'm not a town planner. I'm not the town planner. And I think there is a lot of stuff. I'm not just talking about archaeological park or something like that, but for the museums and for the educational value, this site in particular has an enormous amount to offer. And we have started investigating it, but as I say, we've only investigated a small section. So I'll finish with the acknowledgements. Thank you very much to my team.